Many of you might be aware of the story The Flying Dutchman, but did you guys know that partially some of the story is based on an actual person? Probably not, now you do. Funnily enough, no one actually knew this until researchers and historians discovered a very new document. Well, it's not technically new when it comes from, the 18th century, but it was a document that they hadn't seen before. It was a document from a ship's log, and that is the reason why we know it. So in this video, I will tell you everything about the Flying Dutchman, from what the story is about to who it's supposedly based on. So there are many variations of the Flying Dutch story, or the ghost ship, or whatever you want to call it. It's originally a Dutch story. Some people seem to think that it's an English story, but that is not correct. The most famous story of the Phantom Ship, or of, the Flying Dutchman, is English. But yeah, it originates from stories from Dutch sailors. So in Dutch, the story was often called het Vliegende Schip, or the Flying Ship, or het Verwenste Schip, or the Cursed Ship. So, like I said, the most famous version of the Flying Dutchman, or the Phantom Ship, was written by an English writer named Frederik Marryat. And for those of you who know it, you might have read, some interesting things in the story. And here's a small summary of the story of Marryat. It's the 17th century and it's an Easter Sunday, and despite the fact that it's a religious holiday, Captain Willem van der Dekke set sail with his ship from the Dutch harbour of Terneuzen to the Dutch East Indies. When he comes to Cape of Good Hope, it suddenly starts storming and his crew refuses to continue sailing, which makes Captain Willem furious. So furious that he throws his helmsman overboard while screaming, God of de duivel, de kaap vaar ik om, al moet ik varen tot het laatste oordeel, which translates to, God or the devil, I will sail around the cape, even if I must sail to the last judgment. So they start sailing and eventually reach, Cape of Good Hope, where the captain said ended up cursing him and the ship, making the ship sail forever across the seas. And other captains who passed the Flying Dutchman after that meet a horrible fate. Ships get shipwrecked, people fall ill, people die, there are accidents, and so on. Sometimes Willem van der Dekke, who is the captain of the Flying Dutchman in this story, sends a boat filled with letters addressed to people who have long since died to other ships. Yet another sign that the Vliegende Hollander, or Flying Dutchman, has been wandering the world's seas for centuries. And the story is still connected to the city of Terneuzen today. Now, Marryat wrote a Phantom Ship in 1837, and the story was in some ways very different from the Dutch variations. You might think why. In the full version of Marryat's story, he actually mocks Dutch people, and the English made this version about a Dutch captain very popular. And at that time, the Dutch was the biggest competitor of the English at sea for a while, so we had big fleets, faster ships, all those things. Marryat also lived in Terneuzen, which is a city he says the Flying Dutchman ship originated from, but the reason he used Terneuzen is because he was part of the English invasion of the island of Walcheren in 1809 and later moved with his daughter to Terneuzen, which is the city that he said the Flying Dutchman came from. Some think that he didn't enjoy his time in Terneuzen, and that is why he made it the home base of the cursed ship. But yeah, we can't ask him now, so we don't know. Another thing is that the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, never had a harbour in Terneuzen, so it's factually, if you look at the facts, it's impossible for the ship to have come from Terneuzen. Other variations have the ship starting in Amsterdam, and that is way more plausible because the VOC did have, the offices there and so on. And where in his story, so Marryat's story, the captain's name is Willem van der Dekke, other Dutch variations of the story give the captain, besides Willem van der Dekke, or Hendrik van der Dekke sometimes, also the names Ramhout van Dam, Van Straten, Pieter van Halen, or Barend Fokke. Now the last name is from a former Dutch East India Company captain who actually existed. Dun, 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 dun. He was born around 1635 on the island of Terschelling in the north of the Netherlands and started working for the VOC in 1656. Now, in his ship's logs, he wrote about a journey with a small ship and crew from the Netherlands to Ceylon, which is nowadays Sri Lanka, in 1674. So they ended up shipwrecked near the Maldives and floated around the sea for 22 days in a small boat. They survived on coconuts and finally reached Kochi, India, after 3 weeks. From there, they traveled to Batavia, which is nowadays Jakarta in Indonesia, and in July 1674, he returns to the Netherlands. Now, shortly after his return, Barend Fokke asked the board of the VOC to build him a lightship where he could bring letters and documents to Cape of Good Hope and the Dutch Indies. They agree, because he has done some brilliant work for the VOC for almost 20 years already, and his first task in his new ship is to deliver confidential letters to the Governor-General in Batavia. Now, he left the Netherlands on the 3rd of November 1677 and arrived on the 8th of April 1678. Everyone, and I mean everyone, was in shock that it took him such a short amount of time to complete the journey. Around 5 months, whereas big ships took like 8 to 12 months over the same journey. And if you think the return journey would take him longer, then you're wrong, because it only took him 140 days or 4.5 months to go back, and he didn't even go straight away, because he also delivered letters in Ceylon and took a break of a week in Cape of Good Hope. So he was like fast. Now, besides that, Barend Fokke is an excellent navigator, very courageous, has endless experience, and after the trip he returns to Terschelling, to the island in the north of the Netherlands. He then sells his house at Terschelling and then he buys a house in Amsterdam. And at the same time he got an important position at the VOC, where he became responsible for the construction and equipment of ships. He still goes out to sea often and will sail for the VOC until he basically dies. Now, remember where in the first part I mentioned how the Flying Dutchman was an incredibly fast ship that sometimes delivered old letters? Does it start to ring a bell? For a long period there was no proof that the Flying Dutchman was based on Barend Fokke or based on anyone at all. But that was until historians discovered the new source that I was talking about in the beginning. So a piece written by Vice Admiral Jacobus Boele, who lived from 1791 to 1876 after Barend Fokke already died. He was buried in Amsterdam in like the early 1700s. Jacobus was the son of a VOC captain, and in a travel report he writes about seeing the ship in the night and disappearing again in the morning. He also writes that Barend Fokke is the reason for his story, as he was a very courageous captain who sailed at fast speed and across high waves as if they were nothing. Jacobus Boele also writes that Dutch sailors exaggerated his stories, obviously, what else are you going to do all those months on sea? And some stories say that Fokke would have been half a giant or cursed like a pirate. Then after some time, no one had heard anything from Barend Fokke and his crew, so people assumed he cursed himself and his entire crew, making them sail for eternity. And Dutch sailors then started sharing the tale with the English sailors, and before you know it, the Flying Dutchman is here. Without the name Barend Fokke included, perhaps because they couldn't pronounce it, we'll never know. So what is the history of the way that the stories about the Flying Dutchman were shared? Now, all over the world there are endless stories about ghost ships, which were often spread from sailor to sailor. Now, obviously, oceans can be very rough, and it's well known that mirages can arise, especially when there are two ocean currents, combining themselves. The water can get very rough as well. And that means that sometimes it can look like a ship can be seen in the air, which makes it seem like it's floating above the waves. That's also likely why English Prince George, later King George V, wrote that he saw the ship in 1881. Also, the fact that, British sailors who were often drunk as they got rum until 1970s or so might play a small part. Some historians have also done some extra research, and they found that the first ghost ship stories from the English that were connected to the Netherlands date back to the 18th century, and it was possibly inspired by the rivalry between the English and the Dutch in overseas trade. So the Dutch were so-called money wolves. We did everything for money. They would even sail on an important religious holiday, yada yada yada. And the Dutch trading fleet was also very large, so it is said that there was some jealousy from the English. And after a while, the stories became bigger, the names and residences changed. It lived a life on its own. However, in nice Dutch manners, we have completely embraced the entire story, including the bad versions of it. But funnily enough, for a long period of time, these stories were just shared by talking sailors. However, once it was published in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, it spread even further and made even more people aware of the story and believe in the story. But yeah, like I said, the name Hendrik van der Decken or Willem van der Decken is not written down in any ship's logs of the Dutch East India Company anywhere from the 17th to 19th century, so on. They've checked it all, it's not there. Barend Fokke's name, however, is there. If there is a Flying Dutchman, Barend Fokke is your guy. He's our guy. He's it.